Welcome back to NeuroDiverse Christian Couples. I'm Stephanie.
I'm Dan.
And we have with us as our guest, Amy Glaser. Welcome to the show.
Hi, I'm glad to be here.
So I want to introduce to you a little bit how I met Amy, because I did one of her classes through Alive and Well, which I heard about through Deeper Walk International. But I want to tell you guys what you can expect this month. Sometimes I put together podcasts that kind of all build on each other. And so today we're going to be talking with Amy about Big Six emotions, fear bonds, return to joyful identity. That's kind of our theme. The next week, you'll hear from me, Barb, and Jana M. Smith. We're going to be talking about resiliency and bouncing back and buoyancy. June 16th, you'll hear from Dr. Lehman. We're going to talk about trauma and the verbal logic explainer and how our trauma can jade the stories that we tell ourselves. June 18th, Dan has a one-on-one with Jeff Holzclaw. Does God even like me? Attachment to God. Then June 23rd, we'll have Ed Corey. You may have heard that name because he's part of a lot of the joy books that are out there with Dr. Wilder. But we'll actually be talking about his book, The Face of Grace, and how grace in our brain is a little bit different than joy in our brain. And then finally, we end the month with the Corsies about returning to joy. We'll talk about their book, 30 Days of Joy, and how Dan and I modified that for neurodiverse couples.
30 years of joy.
Yeah,
This is
it's like 30 weeks of joy for us. So, but that's how we had to do it. All right. And then in the fall, you'll want to go to homesasr.com. Our fall classes are now up. We'll be doing enemy mode or escaping enemy mode from Wilder and Woolridge as one of our classes, and we'll be doing Uniquely Us based on our book. All right, turning it to our guest, I met Amy. I was attending Deeper Walk International. Dr. Marcus Warner was one of the speakers. Dr. Wilder was one of the speakers. I just forgot, I think it's Marlene Allen was one of the speakers who will be on the show later this year. And they mentioned Alive and Well and mentioned that you could do this class to kind of practice some of these skills. So I was like, oh, I'm going to do that right now. So I went to Alive and Well while somebody was talking and signed up for the Return to Joy class. And I had a wonderful experience practicing in triads, breathing, quieting, appreciation. And it was a wonderful experience to help you practice the things that we've been reading about. As we've talked about, move it from that left brain over to the right brain and actually practicing. So Amy, will you introduce yourself and how you got involved with this neuroscience piece of joy and breaking fear bonds?
Yeah. So about 12 or 13 years ago, I attended a conference and actually Ed Corey was speaking. And he was talking about joy as someone is glad to be with me, or we are glad to be together, and how that impacts the way our brain is wired. And so I told my friends, I was like, you guys can go to any breakout sessions you want, but I'm following this guy around because this is what I need. And so I dove deep into the Thrive training, which works on these skills. I led classes at my church, and then I was invited in to be a Thrive trainer. And I created something called Journey Groups, which is a relational discipleship online courses that can also be done locally, and brought those to Deeper Walk in 2018, and then over to Alive and Well in 2021. And so then began creating, Dr. Wilder and I had conversations around this idea of fear bonds. And he was talking about how that is like a core, key, basic thing we need to deal with. And I said, well, we do not have a course about that, so we need to remedy that. So he and I did a seminar, and I can share a link later. You can find that at LifeModelWorks.org. And then we launched that 7-week course. It's called Motivated by Joy. And there's a series of 3 courses. So yeah, I love doing this stuff and interacting with people and helping them both understand things in a simpler way, because it can be a little bit complicated at times, but also just identifying what are the practices that we need to do. So that's a little bit about me.
All right, and I'll say from the experience, it's well done in like a class you've never experienced before. So, Amy, let's start. We kind of gave you some questions because I asked some of the ladies that have been in my classes, what are some things you want to know? What are some things that kind of trip you up when we talk about returning to joy? Because in a lot of our classes now, we're implementing something about fear and joy and love bonds and Hesed and all the good stuff. So this question comes up a lot. When I hear return to joy, it feels like don't feel your feelings, don't face your feelings. The stuff I learned at church, just be happy, just, dig deeper, choose joy. Now, I know you're not saying that, but when I hear you say that, that's what I think. So, how do I experience my feelings and remain relational in my big six emotions? Because I'm not a robot, I'm not a saint, and I've got these emotions. So, Amy, how would you start addressing that question?
Yeah. So if we remember that joy means that we're glad to be together, that actually doesn't say anything about not having difficult emotions or not acknowledging them. It just means that we can be glad to be together in them. And many of us didn't learn that in our family of origin. And so return to joy just means that I am able to quiet myself enough to remember, oh, I'm glad somebody is here with me in this. And so a lot of times in the return to joy, the reconnection with a person is where we actually begin to process those difficult emotions, or a return to joy with God, that we get reconnected with Him. So it's actually all about allowing ourselves to feel our emotions and to process them, but it is in a more healthy way of not suppressing them and not blowing up, but being able to be connected with somebody in our big emotions. So, yeah.
So going to that idea of processing it without blowing it up, how walk us through how we could process our emotions, live in it, but not amplify it.
Yeah. Well, that was a big one for me because when I came into these materials, I was full of big emotions and I amplified all of the negativity. So I really get that. I feel it deeply. So the first thing is to be able to connect to the feeling that I'm feeling, more so than the story that I'm telling myself. And so I want to be able to say, so for instance, anger is one of those emotions that can really get blown up. I want to take a deep breath and I want to acknowledge, wow, I am feeling angry right now. And in my body, that feels like my chest is tight. I feel like my heart is beating really fast. My face is flushed. Wow, I am really feeling it. This is really big. And so I'm staying connected to my body and the emotion rather than retelling the story. So that's what I had learned, was that if you tell the story often enough, some magical thing is supposed to happen and the emotion is going to go away. And what I was actually doing was like putting the anger on a loop. So if we can get in touch with, my friend Sungshim Lopnow says, get in touch with state rather than story. And so if I can stay with the actual emotion, then I will notice that it begins to ebb. And now I can actually come back to the story and come up with a solution that is not driven by my anger, but is driven by my best self, which is located at a different place in my brain.
How do you keep the next telling of the story from resurfacing the emotion you just processed?
Yeah, so this goes back to the idea that we want, and Dr. Lehman will be talking about this, the idea that we're going to have to connect with Jesus around, or with a healthy friend, around what might be behind how big my reaction was, because we are meeting each other nervous system to nervous system and history to history. So my history has a whole lot to do with whether I'm going to be able to keep that, to allow that story to pass. So yeah, we process with Jesus, like, okay, where were you and what was going on in that early time that I felt this emotion? And what do you have for me here? So that the next time, so it's kind of like having a vat of upset. And when we connect with Jesus or connect with a healthy person, it drains off some of that so that the next time that it comes up, it's not quite so big and so intense.
How do you know it's working? So go back to the process the emotion without amplifying it. How do you know that you're actually doing the self-talk, the body connection, such that you are slowing down, de-escalating without, not, and it be, because I can see how that would be something that somebody would say, well, I'm sitting here talking to myself and I don't feel any different. What's the noticeable effect? How do you recognize that this mechanism you're using is being effective and you need to keep doing it, or perhaps you should adjust?
Oh, that's so good. Yeah, so we need to reconnect to our bodies so if I finish that process and I go back to the story, if all of my feelings are at the same level that they were when I started, then I need to continue the process. So it's not that the process necessarily didn't work, but that I need to go through it again, and I may need to say, oh, okay, so this is not just about this story. This is definitely about all the times that this has happened before, and I need to get some healing for that. So let me connect with Jesus around this historical stuff. But as we reconnect with our body, and the shift does not happen immediately. So we may have to do this a number of times in different situations before we begin to notice. Because in our culture, we don't tend to be super connected to our bodies. And so if I go back and I go, okay, oh, I actually, I had a situation, for instance, once where I realized I had been walking around and I had pain in the diaphragm, the muscle under my rib cage, because I was carrying a lot of tension and upset. And so I had a time of deep connection with Jesus and allowing my own emotions to flow and for him to be with me and to see me and hear me and understand me. And afterwards, I was like, oh my goodness, I am not hurting right here anymore. And I had not realized I've been carrying that around for a long time. So I think it's very important for us to understand that this is a process. This is not okay, I'm going to do this one time and it's going to shift everything. So the shifts can be very small. But one of the shifts that happens is that we know we now have something that we can do. And so we feel a little bit of hope. And so we don't have so much fear, which we're talking about fear bonds and fear motivations. We don't have so much fear of that emotion. And so I don't have to fear the next time I'm going to feel it.
So before we start talking about how relationships can go into fear bonds, I wanted to echo something that you said a question ago. You said when you have a big emotion, you may need to process, so we can process it with Jesus and with a healthy friend who has the capacity. So our couples are usually experiencing a lot of big emotions. They get stuck in trauma cycles. Folks who are neurodivergent don't usually have a lot of capacity for big emotions. And you said something in our class that if someone doesn't have the capacity or the resilience, that's not a sin. It's a weakness. And so we would hope that person would want to grow their capacity and resilience. But for me and my maturity, I need to know who has the capacity to bear some of my big emotions and who doesn't have the capacity to bear my big emotions. Would you talk a little bit about that and sharing with other people who may not have the capacity to help you carry your big emotions?
Yeah. So, what we want to do is check with people. And so we have to start with something, with a story that is smaller about an upset. So if I'm trying to see if you, Stephanie, have the capacity, then I might share with you about an upset that I have with my daughter, but our relationship is generally good. And then see how you respond to that and watch and see, does Stephanie, does she get me? Is she seeing me, hearing me, understanding me? Is she able to avoid giving advice? Is she able to recognize my emotions without getting overwhelmed or going into it herself so much that it's amplified or blown up or she has to check out? Um, and does she encourage me after hearing and being with me in it and allowing me to feel it? Does she encourage me towards my true self, the person God created me to be? And so, if a person cannot handle our emotions in a more a smaller emotional situation, then we know that they're not the one that has the capacity for the bigger. And this can be very frustrating in marriage, but the more we identify other people who are safe, so they keep things confidential, they don't take on offenses on our behalf, and of course we recommend same gender, um, then it's kind of like draining that vat that I was talking about. Like, oh, okay, so I have this situation and I've talked with Stephanie about it, and now the intensity has gone down, and I don't feel that urgent need to talk to my spouse right now and come at them with so much. So, yeah.
So a little bit of before we switch topics, a little bit more on that idea is, if I'm in the middle of a big emotion and I've got an invitation from someone to say, share that with me, but I don't feel like I want to, that's not the right person. That person could take offense to the fact that I don't want to share with them, but the reality is I don't feel like that's a great place to share whatever it is I'm feeling. What does the communication look like in that situation of, you know what? I don't think I'm going to give you this pearl.
Right.
What does that interaction look like to not actually make it worse?
Right. Oh, that is such a great question. So it might look like something like, wow, I so appreciate that you want to be with me in this, and I'm not really ready to talk about it with you yet. Or I'm not comfortable talking about it with you at this time. Um, Thank you so much. What I would love is for if we could just sit quietly together. Might be an option. I'm not saying we have to do that, but yeah, just appreciating the fact that somebody wants to be with us in it, and then just being comfortable with setting that boundary. And the reality is, one of the things I often say in my courses is, just because you get a bad response from someone doesn't mean you did it wrong. So we want to offer to make ourselves understood. Yeah, I'm not really ready to talk about that right now with you. That's my responsibility to put it out there, to make myself understood. It's not my responsibility to make sure that you understand it and you like it and you can handle it. And so this is something we want to learn, that okay, I'm going to let him know that this is, I don't want to share with him right now. And I am not going to let the fact that he might not have a good response prevent me from being true to myself.
All right. So as we segue into fear bonds,
Yeah.
it's probably important to preface such a thing with presuming both people have now perhaps recognized that fear bonds are in place. And we'll get to how you recognize that here in a minute. If that's true, then it would seem to make this interaction a bit easier, because the invitation to, I'm not necessarily going to share with you everything, but I am willing to do this. An invitation to engage in what I feel like is a safe place, a appropriate place for where we are. I restate that because if you're the other person, recognize that not as a negative, but as a positive, right? If we're in the process of breaking a fear bond, the invitation to sit on the couch and not talk, for instance, and be just physically near might be the first step in fear bond dissolution. I don't know what you do. Dissolution.
Sure, why not?
Shifting. Yeah. That's very true. So we can use the phrase fear bonds, and another way to refer to it is to talk about fear motivations, because in our very, very earliest months and years of childhood, our brain is wired with whatever our parents' motivation is. And so our parents may be motivated by fear, they may be motivated by anger, they may be motivated by joy if we're really, really blessed. So we take on that motivation. And so we're going to kind of move out into the world with that. We may notice, because a lot of people ask me about, well, I feel like I seem to have these kind of fear bonds with this kind of person, but not this kind of person. Well, yes, we download our brains from both parents and from anybody else who spends a significant amount of time with us as infants. So we're going to get motivations from more than one person. And so that's going to impact us. So as we consider, that also helps us in relationships. If we can say, we have some fear motivations going on here. I notice that I am being motivated by my fear of your response, or my fear that we're going to be disconnected somewhat. So even just shifting our language to use the word motivation a little bit more than we use the word fear bond, because also the other thing is that fear bond sounds like, oh, I'm talking about our relationship, this one relationship. And the fact is if we have one fear bond, then the majority of our relationships are actually being impacted by some fear motivation. So just putting it out there that, like, oh yeah, I have these fear motivations, totally reasonable that I got these early in life, and I'm working to shift towards joy motivations instead.